on a piece of white paper. And all right, well, this time let's start out with a little traditional media sketch. This is just a little pen sketch on a piece of white paper, and I'm going to select the background off of it. And this demo, it's going to be about 45 minutes, and you'll see it follow the same sort of similar steps as the previous tutorials. Drop in a background first. I selected my drawing, deleted the white background, then I darkened its value, and that's usually how I start. This one's going to be much more painterly and illustrative as opposed to the car, which was much tighter using paths everywhere. We'll use a few paths probably towards the end just to clean up some edges. But one of the fastest ways to start these is just create your silhouette, one layer, as you can see on the right, and then put another layer. Actually, I don't even have another layer. I have a layer above, but I'm not painting on it. Right now I'm just using a multiply brush, and I started out at the beginning with a color dodge brush. The color dodge was set to white, and that was just pulling up some light areas. And then I have multiply. You see it there set to like 50% opacity with an airbrush. And that's how I set up really quickly all of my base values and all the form transitions just to get a light side, a number 2 side, and a shadow side. Then one of my favorite brushes to use is just like a big ellipse with a hard edge. And you'll see I'm doing all my painting on a clipping path layer above the base layer. The base layer, all it does is set up my base values, my lights, my darks, and the silhouette. And then I put a clipping path layer above it. And again, if you hold down the Alt or Option key on a Mac, as your cursor slides over the dividing line between those two layers, you'll get a little hand icon. Just click it when you have the hand icon, and it will make a clipping path layer. And that only allows me to add value, or effectively just think of it, I can only paint where I already have pixels on the layer below. So what that means is my silhouette stays consistent. And all I'm doing is sculpting form, right? It's really simple. We're not even worrying about perspective yet. It's basically just making things go bump. And this ellipse has pressure sensitivity turned up, both for flow and transfer. Those are both turned up all the way, and then you can do that underneath your brush settings. And you'll see it makes for kind of a rough, you get rough gradations, but I don't even mind so much. It's really just, I'm trying to block in and discover the forms. So all I'm doing is light side, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadows, all the same things we've done throughout the entire book when it comes to value and form rendering. And this video has been sped up, I would say about 400% on average throughout. So if this was a 45-minute, this entire rendering was probably about 3 hours, sped up to 45 minutes, just so you can get a gauge of the speed. I wish I could paint that fast, render that fast, but nope. But it gets a little boring if we watch the real time, and you don't learn that much more, because you can just see it's one brush, one layer, and all I'm doing, and you'll see it, the eyedropper pops up. It's because I have a button on my pen, again set to option, and I just start picking the values from within the rendering, and I don't have to have my swatches pop up, nothing. I can just sort of sit and start to render. And this for me is one of the most fun things to do, is render form just in grayscale, right? Just working on the value changes and trying to apply the fundamentals of everything that we've covered so far in the book. So light and shadow, cast shadows are a critical part, as well as occlusion shadows, to making things look three-dimensional and getting your overlaps working. So my light in this case is from the upper left, maybe not quite at a 45, maybe 30-degree angle from vertical. And you can see it's a strong direct light because I'm putting in some strong hard edge cast shadows. And you have to really you need to design those cast shadow shapes quite a bit because they can become graphically very strong. So be aware of those, and if the graphic shape of the shadows is becoming too distracting, then switch your light source to a softer edged light source and make all your cast shadows soft. And that will minimize the graphic nature of the shadows. But if you have a hard light source, like if it's outdoor sunlight for instance, on a clear day, those shadows are really what help tell the story of the type of light. So they're very interconnected. And you can see I had a ragged edge on my silhouette, and that's because I just used the magic wand to select my line drawing off of my background. You'll also notice that the line drawing over on the right hand side is still there floating on top. Should I ever lose my line drawing, I can just turn that back on, have it set to multiply if I want to refer back to the original design sketch. I've also flattened down my clipping path layer, so you can see over there the blue highlighted layer is just now all the value, the line drawing, everything is on one layer, and all I'm doing is erasing with a hard edge eraser, just cleaning up the silhouette by hand. Now this is sort of the rough discovery phase still of doing a big rendering. Here I'm adding a little bit of perspective, so when we see those things are a bit circular in cross section, so if our vanishing point is somewhere near the mid torso of this shape, we could see a little bit of the front of each of those segments. And this noodling is kind of, I've already started kind of noodling in some details here. This can take a while, especially if I was to get all of those symmetrical. I would probably just render one of them and cut and paste it and then just warp it to create the shape change. But in this case I'm just doing it all freehand, and this again is much more like sort of like marker rendering. Like if I had some Copic markers, this is the same sort of way I would go, except I couldn't use white as easily, so I'd have to think ahead a little bit more. Working inside, in this case, Photoshop or something like Sketchbook Pro or Painter, you can just sit and use white, just as opaque as black. So it's kind of a much simpler medium, I think. Digital rendering is much easier. You also have Command Z. You also have layers. But the same things, and you could do it, of course, with marker. You could use white. You just use like a white colored pencil. Or you could be doing the same sort of thing with acrylic paint. And just pushing and pulling on surfaces using the light and the shadow. And when you really get the values dialed in and working, and there's a little reflected light coming off those lit surfaces, so it's bouncing off the leg and this little fin sticking out and bouncing up and illuminating those areas that are rolling under. And remember, don't let that reflected light look like it's too strong. Don't make it as strong as the primary light source. That's pretty strong there, but still works. Still looks like it's in cast shadow. I'll probably knock it down a little bit more. So this is really an exercise in, making things go bump, basically. And when you get it really dialed in, as I was starting to say, it really starts to feel like you're sculpting with clay. So if you're a sculptor and you have some background in sculpting, and you get your values just right, and you get all your tools, you get your Wacom tablet, whatever you might be using, your markers and pencil, you get that just dialed in right, and you get enough control, you can start to feel like you're sculpting. And that's when it becomes the most fun for me, is when it feels like clay. Because I used to sculpt a lot in clay, in automotive clay, and this kind of, for me, feels the same. It's kind of pushing and pulling and sort of infinite variation, and you can just get smaller and smaller with your radii and fillets and blending surfaces together. You can see I just started to add a little bit of symmetry there for the far side lag. I don't know if that's where it's going to stay, but just to give me a sense that there's a little depth to this. It's actually the same exact steps that Neville Page was doing back, I can't remember what page his dinosaur was on. But it's the same sort of thing. I'm just using digital tools, and in that case he was using all pencil. And cleaning up my silhouette again. See, this is why I sped up this video, because to see something this detailed at real time gets to be a bit tedious. Not a lot changes, to be honest, from now to the end. It's just this same sort of thing. It's cleaning up silhouette. Once I have the silhouette cleaned up, I'll either hit preserve transparency to come back and render the form, or I'll put on a clipping path layer, one or the other. But for this demo for the book, I wanted to do something that had a lot of complexity, that was a bit abstract. That was not a car, wasn't an airplane, wasn't, a building or a teapot or something like that. I wanted to do something that was organic, yet mechanical, and had a lot of variety of forms and a lot of details, just so you can see that the same rendering technique is basically applied over and over and over again. All you're doing is changing the silhouette and the fullness or flatness of surfaces. Adding, I'm taking my best guess, obviously, at the cast shadows. I'm not calculating anything, so it really is a guess. But what's fun is you can really start to bring form to something and bring life to it without even having to really worry about perspective. You just start to push and pull and sculpt the form. To be honest, this is about as complex as renderings get for the sort of things that I do, whether it be vehicles or products or environments or characters, especially for the entertainment world. You can go, at a certain point, it just becomes a function of time, and how tight a value rendering gets is really dependent on how much time you're given to finish that rendering. And most of the time, it can stay quite sketchy and still communicate the idea. Like, we could see the idea of this even from our little pen sketch. And then we could also see the idea just with that first block in of the color dodging and material, the multiply layer or multiply brush, that I was using. In the first 10 minutes, you get the idea across, but there's no subtlety to the forms. There's no detailing, and you sort of work through a hierarchy of what is important when. Meaning, if I want to communicate big, gross silhouette, I could just do this whole thing with, a black Sharpie marker on a piece of white paper. If I then want to start to add a couple more details, I might have to grab a different pen or start with gray Copic markers, for instance. And usually what I do is you give yourself an amount of time that matches the medium that you're using. So what I mean by that is if I'm doing a marker sketch or a Sharpie, for instance, I know I don't have a lot of time. So I sort of bang it out really fast, get the big silhouette done. Then if I have time, I might scan that and start to add the surfacing and details at this level. In this case, I knew I was going for a much more finished rendering. I still wanted to sort of do it all painterly and almost all by hand. Here's a path I'm using to clean up that edge. You'll see it's going to be a lot faster than trying to paint out that edge. I just made a shape, hit the third button from the left on the path menu, and that created a selection, and then I just hit delete. Here I'm mirroring the leg to the far side, and I'm just going to darken it down by changing the levels. And now adjusting the base layer, erasing a little bit, so we have a mirror image of that leg on the far side. So saying that they're basically the same. And I just posed it a little bit. Again, the perspective is very loose, but you get the idea. We'll tighten up the perspective as it gets a little bit more finished. So even though this is all done, just with minimal paths to help clean up the silhouettes, it's kind of one of my favorite ways to work, is to freehand everything on the interior. Unless you'll see at the very, very end, we'll add a couple of circular details. Those are tough to freehand. Of course, you can use a hard edge circular brush, which makes it easier to do. But I tend to use this hard edged ellipse when I'm doing a lot of form exploration. And the reason for that is that, yes, the big gradations look a little bit scruffy, but I know I'm probably going to come back and re-render everything in a cleanup pass. So when I'm discovering form through the application of value, I like to have that ability to put in a hard edge and a gradation. And that's where this ellipse brush kind of does both, because I have it's very pressure sensitive, meaning you don't have to push, you have to do multiple strokes to build up the value. You won't get 100% opaque in one stroke. So because it's hard to build up the value, that means it builds up slowly, and you can start to build up layers almost like you're using an acrylic brush and acrylic paint, glazing over an area multiple times to add more and more value change. You sort of have to do the same with this hard edge brush. And I don't mind that. It kind of adds, a nice patina to the surface. Those little, the marks that you make with that brush kind of give it a nice hand done feel. And again, all my lighting here is I'm essentially taking my best guess at it. So again, upper left. So I know the left side of this leg, which is kind of like a big cone, the left side is going to be in light, the right side is going to be in shadow. And anywhere that there's a surface that's more perpendicular to the light source, like that little hook right down at the bottom there, where that surface turns back, that's going to be brighter. And that's the basic rule from observing all those geoforms early in the book. And in my mind, that's what I'm thinking about. This is kind of like a cone. This is kind of like a sphere. This is kind of like a cylinder. Another part might be is flat and planar. And so I always think back to those as my guide to help figure out these forms kind of on the fly. And then, to be honest, at the end of the day, when you're trying to communicate a surface, that you just need to turn it with a value. So if you want to make a little form read, by all means take a little artistic license. You have to be a little bit careful, because it means if you take too much artistic license, you might not be able to build that surface in a 3D model. But usually these renderings are not meant to be the end all, right? You're making discoveries here in 2D, which then as you start to model in 3D, you'll also make discoveries. So this is just a general guide to get that surfacing started and get that modeling step started, even if you're doing a digital model or you're really going to go sculpt this in clay. You're sort of just taking your best guess, and it will be very helpful, especially if you're handing this off to a modeler. The more true you are, meaning not cheating, not so much artistic license on how you add your values and multiple light sources and things, the easier it will be for somebody else to model. Now they're going